Thank you very much, everybody, and good morning. So, what I'm going to do in this presentation is just outline, I suppose, the key policy objectives from agriculture from a water quality improvement point of view, the collaborative approach that's ongoing in terms to achieving those objectives, which include regulatory measures and measures outside of regulation, so touching on some of those, and obviously having some concluding points from it all. So, in terms of agriculture policy objectives, there are many when it comes to water quality. From agriculture, we want to build a nitrates action programme that's been in place since 2006, and we want to make that as robust as possible. We want to continue the momentum that was built in 2022. So back in 2022 was the implementation of the 5th Nitrates Action Programme, and there was a significant number of measures introduced in that period. So we want to see those measures certainly make their impact and see their fruition and build on that. Ultimately, we want to improve water quality and to retain the nitrates derogation. So how do we achieve those policy objectives? So the government last August, they published a plan known as the Water and Agriculture, a Collaborative Approach, published by the Department of Agriculture. And this plan sets out it's a summary of the collaborative and unprecedented approaches that are being taken to improve water quality from an agricultural perspective. The plan outlines a number of ranges of measures that are in place, from regulatory, government financial supports, collaboration and incentives, work going on with government, industry and farmers in tandem, a number of other further actions, as well as the government's approach to securing the Ireland's next nitrates derogation. So, touching on the regulation point, as I mentioned before, there's significant regulatory changes have been introduced back in 2022, and these are introduced into regulation under the GAP measures, the Good Agricultural Practice measures. Key measures at that point in time was a 10% cut in chemical fertiliser allowances for grassland areas. There was an extension to the closed periods for slurry spreading, chemical fertilisers and soil water. There was the introduction of the dairy cow excretion bans, which meant that there was higher excretion rate for dairy cows. There was a requirement to establish green cover on tillage land post-harvest. There was an extension of the requirement for soil sampling and low-emission slurry spreading extended out to more cohort of farmers, not just the intensive farmers. And there was the introduction of the National Fertiliser Database as well, which was introduced to allow for better tracking of sales and movements of fertiliser usages at individual farm level. And as well, then there was a requirement when it came to the implementing decision of the nitrates derogation. There was conditionalities put on that, and one of those conditionalities, if anyone recalls, was a water quality review. And the resultant of that water quality review was that the derogation limit in many parts of the country was reduced down from 250 to 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for those farmers. As part of the 5th NAP, when it was introduced in 2022, there was the there was a requirement to do an interim review of the 5th Nitrates Action Programme. And the resulting of that, and put into legal effect through an amendment of the GAP regulations this year, was the additional measures. So some of those key measures was the extension of the areas for 220 of livestock manure per hectare in other areas, so that weren't covered under that EU Commission water quality review, the extension of additional areas where it was identified that a reduction in nitrates was needed using the EPA's target measure map. So further areas were brought in, and those areas will have a 220 limit effective from the 1st of December this year. There was revised bovine excretion rates. There was a reduction in crude protein being allowances to be fed during the summer period from 15 to 14%, and this was extended out to the requirement of all farmers where they have bovines above 2 years of age. There was the inclusion of a recognition for the dairy herd. So if a dairy herd wanted to feed a lower than average crude protein throughout the year, this could be recognised in lower excretion rates. There was a further 5% reduction in the chemical allowances for higher stock farms, and the introduction of a new lower limit category for extensive farms for chemical nitrogen allowances. There was the introduction of a 30-kilometre rule for nitrates derogation applicants. So where that was is where it was identifiable that a derogation applicant have land that's 30 kilometres away from their main primary block. That land is subject to 170 kilogram of organic N per limit unless they show demonstrable evidence to the department where it's being farmed at a similar intensity as their home farm block. There's a mandatory inclusion then for clover when reseeding perennial ryegrass, so this was previously just more intensive farms. This is now being extended out to all farmers when they're reseeding grassland. There's a provision then to restrict the use of unprotected urea in the granule form, which will be introduced in September. And is also tightening up in terms of the time frame in which to notify the department of organic movements, moving to required to do within 4 days of the export taking place. So that's just a number of the many measures that were introduced under the additional measures of the interim review of the fifth NAP. But there's a lot of work that's been ongoing outside of just regulation, as I've spoken about in the collaborative approach, incentives and supports. So in terms of incentives, one of the key things that many might realise about is the Farming for Water EIP that got up and running last year. So that's 60 million in that programme over 5 years, targeting 15,000 farmers. So 50 million of that is ring-fenced for farmers. So these are farmers to do measures above and beyond the regulatory measures. So looking to see more targeted approach in terms of the measures that could be implemented on those particular farms. There's incentives then for farmers through the CAP strategic plan pillars under schemes. So for TAMS, which is a Targeted Agriculture Modernisation Scheme, where if they want to put in more nutrient storage facilities, low emission spreading equipment. Acres as well provides actions in terms of measures such as buffer strips or buffer zones or tree planting that can help water quality improvement. And there's the organic scheme, which is leveraging for farmers to alleviate themselves away from inorganic inputs. For others that are certainly when they're looking for big investments and support incentives into nutrient storages, there are green finance and discount rates out there. And there's also accelerated capital allowances for nutrient storage facilities, which means when you put an investment on a farm for such facilities, you can write that off that in tax in a quicker period over 2 years than would normally be done. So in terms of there's a lot of supports and collaborations that have kind of come about, particularly over the last few years, across the board, across the sector. There was the extension and expansion of the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advisory Programme, known as ASSIP. So this was established back in 2018, a free advice service in terms of, for farmers in terms of improving water quality. And this started with 30 of those advisors, just significantly increased to over 50 now, with a big input and commitment from industry. So most recently, a lot of those advisors are from dairy, and most recently there's now a dedicated beef advisor being supplied from KeyPack. There's the Teagasc Multiple Action Water Quality Advisory Campaign, known as Water Farm for Water, which Pat will go into more detail after me. There's a lot more work ongoing by industry in terms of their sustainability schemes, looking at more specific river catchment projects. So one just to mention, just to note, is for example the Tirlawn with the Slaney catchment. There's the Agricultural Water Quality Group. So this is a group made up of industry stakeholders, so representatives from all the main farm organisation bodies, from industry, from advisory, some of the state bodies and the key government departments, such as the Department and the Department of Housing. So this group was working together in terms of obviously the objective to improve water quality from an agricultural perspective, looking at ways to raise awareness about water quality, get the buy-in to the measures, but also along the way suggesting areas for additional measures, whether they be through regulatory or non-regulatory measures. And certainly a lot of that work has fed into the interim review of the fifth NAP and development of the sixth NAP. There's also the continuation of key programmes, such as the Agricultural Catchments Programme as well. So, there's a lot of work that's ongoing in terms of the collaborations and supports, and there's probably a number of you in the room here today that's on the ground, working in those spaces that can probably know more knowledge about it than I am on the ground. But there's a significant amount of work that's ongoing at the moment. So in terms of, when it comes to the government's commitment in securing Ireland's next nitrates derogation programme, it's a critical component to supporting Ireland's unique system. Ireland is predominantly a grass-based livestock system, and interestingly enough, in the nitrates directive, it doesn't state out derogation. The term derogation, what it states out is a provision to go above the 170 organic N limit, subject to not prejudicing the objectives of the Nitrates Directive, which is to prevent and minimise pollution from agriculture to water. But also there's criteria there that has to be adhered to in order to avail of a derogation, which is, or I should say that provision, is you have to have a long growing season, you have to have crops that have high nitrogen requirements, you have to have high net precipitation and denitrifying soils. So certainly since 2006 in Ireland being able to avail of that derogation, there has been, those have been the key criteria and the justification in terms of availing it, and will be the key criteria as well going forward in seeking this the renewal. In terms of the process then, so there's a form of process, so unlike the Nitrates Action Programme, that has to be agreed in nationally, but if you're seeking a derogation, you have to go to Europe, so you have to formally apply that through the EU Nitrates Committee, which the government did last December. In that process, there's 3 presentations made to the Nitrates Committee over the period of 2025 that looks at the water quality, nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations, and looking at agriculture, looking at the measures that are in place and the proposed measures that will be in place. So once the Commission then have kind of gone through that process, they will propose then a formal implementing decision for a vote. And then once it gets to that stage, then the EU members vote. So in order to have a vote that would renew the derogation, it needs to be a qualified majority vote from those EU member states. So as I said, it has to go through all those stages, but one critical stage of that is to have our 6 Nitrates Action Programme in place and agreed. So work is ongoing in terms of preparation of that, and that's looking to be in place for certainly the introduction of early next year. And those are the processes that have to be in place in terms of to get to those stages with the Commission. So it's an all-of-government approach. As I said, it's set out in the Collaborative Action Plan to secure the derogation. It's set out in the Programme for Government. The commitment is seen in terms of the set-up of a Cabinet Committee in terms of improving water quality. So this is certainly within there, in the policy objectives. So just to conclude then, there's a significant and unprecedented engagement across the Irish farmer community, agri-food industry and government to improve water quality that's been stepped up in recent years. The EPA provided us an early indicator insights report. Within that, the average nitrogen levels in rivers have reduced, so some would say some early signs of progress being made. However, that's just early signs in terms of there's still more work to do. So in terms of to see the impact of those measures further down the line, further to make the improvements in the water quality is needed. So there is work to be done. The government is committed to driving this progress through the stakeholder engagement and getting that right combination and balance of the regulatory and non-regulatory measures and what we have outlined to date and going forward. We now have an all-government and all-agri-food industry engagement around water quality, and the derogation is key to maintaining this level of engagement. So thank you very much.